So at this stage, we're going to look at the context, in particular the genre. This is certainly one of the most important parts. We've looked at finding the ordinary meaning of the passage, which we previously covered as part of the criteria as far as interpretation, hermeneutics. These are the criteria that McQuilkin sets forth. So finding the ordinary meaning. And then secondly, we have, or we are going to, in this particular lesson, find the language type covered. Now, that's the genre, the type of literature that we're going to be studying. It's absolutely imperative we know the type of literature before we launch into any kind of interpretation. Otherwise, we could be interpreting things incorrectly. We will look at each type of genre in particular in a future lesson. But in this particular lesson, there'll be a brief overview of what the possibilities are. So we'll cover the language type. And as I said, we've already covered the ordinary meaning of the passage. And then in the third and major thing that McQuilkin sets forth, we'll work to find the single meaning. So if you'll notice here, before we can find the single meaning of a passage, because that's really what we're looking for, we're not going to attribute a secondary meaning unless the Bible affirms a secondary meaning. But in the future, before we find the single meaning, we need to find the language type. And so, absolutely imperative. Notice this quote by McQuilkin: this kind of analysis attempts to answer such questions as the date and author of a book and the genre or type of literature in any passage. Such study is not inherently rationalistic. Knowing the difference between a law and a proverb, or poetry and an epistle, is helpful in properly understanding the author's meaning. You'll especially find this helpful class as you get into the poetical books, and when we study that particular type of genre, you'll value the importance of interpreting poetry in light of the fact that it's poetry. Notice the second quote as well. As in all human communication, one begins with the assumption that the speaker or the writer is saying something to be taken in its literal meaning. This is something that has distinguished not just Baptists, but most conservative thinkers and interpreters, is that we approach the scripture in a more literal sense. And where the Bible speaks and interprets itself allegorically, for example in Galatians where Paul speaks of Mount Sinai, then we'll interpret that way. But we approach the communication in a literal sense. Again, this is just all laying the groundwork for this overview of genre. Notice here, therefore, literal language must be interpreted literally, figurative language figuratively, and poetic language poetically. And here's an example he gives, McQuilkin: did Jerusalem and all Judea literally go out to hear John the Baptist? That is, did the physical city move out into the wilderness? The obvious answer here is no. It's an expression that's here, that's given. When Jesus said something concerning his body, about the bread, he said, "This is my body." That expression is taken as literal by more than half of those who call themselves Christians. So finding out when and how we interpret these passages is key, and the genre is right at the foundation of that. Notice how the genre or even passages can be taken out of context. In this particular passage, it speaks of a person having a passion to be married. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. And so people may come to this passage, and without considering the context there of 1 Corinthians 7, and they may jump to another passage. Maybe they're reading a gospel and a letter together, and they may jump to a passage like John 13:27, which says, "What you are about to do, do quickly. And so a young man seeing this might think, well, the Bible told me it's a direct command to get married. And in the second command, it gives me the timetable. So I ought to go get married now. God has obviously spoken to me. It's in His Word. And really what the person is doing is he's inconsiderate of the genre, and he's taking the Bible out of context and applying it to his situation. We don't determine the will of God by blindly opening the Bible and pointing to a passage of Scripture. So, having said all that, let's look at several things here, questions we're going to try and answer in this lesson. First is, what form is the passage written in? What form is the passage written in? And make sure you jot these down. This is an outline of the overall lesson. What form is the passage in? Secondly, what are my options? What are my options? So, as we look at the Scripture, some lists of what available genre options there are could be and will be helpful. And we'll list those out for the Old Testament as well as for the New Testament. Thirdly, we're going to try and cover this by giving you some questions. This third question is, how do I scripturally determine literary genre? So is it a subjective process, or are there guiding principles, maybe ways that I can ask questions of the passage to determine the literary genre? How does the immediate context flow into all that? So what is the form of the passage? What form is the passage written in? What are my options, and how do I scripturally determine literary genre? Again, this is just an outline of the overall lesson. Then we're also going to go ahead and move on into what are some basic truths about context. And this will be a general part of the lesson. What are some basic truths of the context? And so we'll cover what form is the passage written in, what are my options, how do I scripturally determine literary genre, and what are some basic truths about context. And context is kind of the house within which that passage lives, the immediate context, broad context, and then biblical context. And then what is so going into this first section, what form is the passage written in? One of the things we immediately want to do, so we're now looking at the first part of the overall outline, what form is the passage written in? We want to note the boundaries of the text, and what I'm not talking about is the chapter and verse divisions. I'm talking about the boundaries that are presented by the grammatical structure. So, we had looked at some of this in the past. Sometimes conjunctions help us to know that the thought or the account is continuing. We'll look at the boundaries in more detail, but boundaries are things you're going to look for in your observation part of your reading. You're going to look for changes in characters, changes in setting. Secondly, so first note the boundaries of the text. Secondly, is it a narrative text? I've used this word several times in the class already. When we talk about narrative, we're talking about a story that is being narrated, or an account. So for example, a large part of the book of Genesis would be narrative. It tells us the story of Joseph and his betrayal. And so those are questions that you want to ask of the text. And so first, note the boundaries of the text. Okay, where does that story end? Sometimes it spans multiple chapters. So that's the third question here, is how many chapters does it span? How many chapters does it span? Sometimes our laziness will cause us to stop at the chapter break, but really that's dangerous, because you may interpret that chapter and you may interpret it incorrectly if you don't know the rest of the narrative account. Next, what are the divisions within the narrative? What are the divisions within the narrative? This, again, goes back to the very first part. The note the boundaries has to do with the overall narrative. And then within the narrative, You'll have changes of scenery. So you'll go from, let's use Joseph's example again, you'll go from him being in a pit to him going with Midianite merchantmen into Egypt. You go from him being in the cellar and in prison all the way to being second in command. And so there are variations in that within that narrative, and those are divisions that you find inside the narrative there. Next, what are my options? What are my genre options? So when I'm looking at the Old Testament, what kind of literature am I going to find? Well, first you're going to find the narrative. And so you are in large part going to find that in the stories in Genesis, and you'll find a lot of that in Exodus, narrative accounts about God's dealings with his people. These narrative accounts will tell you more about God. So you'll find narratives, you'll find law, and this is pretty obvious and probably the one that is very recognizable, at least in our circle. We talk about this, the New Testament references this, but in the Old Testament you'll find the books of the law, and you'll find those repeated outside of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But knowing that you have law and knowing that you have narrative, and when you go to that passage, this is one of the questions you want to ask. What kind of literature am I looking at here as I'm studying, beginning my study? Then you have poetry. You have those 5 books of poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So you have narrative accounts in the Old Testament, you have law, you have poetry. It's not always broken up that way by book. Sometimes a book will have law, poetry, and narrative all in one book. And some of that you have in the book of Isaiah, for example. You also have prophecy. And I mentioned the book of Isaiah just a minute ago. You have narrative in the book of Isaiah. You have law in the book of Isaiah that's recounted. You have some elements of poetry, which is given in song in the book of Isaiah. You have prophecy, obviously Isaiah being one of the major prophets because of the length of that particular book. So even within a book, you might have different kinds of genre, and so you have to pay attention to that depending on what you're reading there. And then you have wisdom. So for example, you do have poetry, but within the poetry, you have wisdom literature. You have wisdom literature in the book of Judges, sometimes given in the form of different riddles. So wisdom literature are going to be very similar, and probably the most famous one is going to be Proverbs, where you have short, quick, abrupt sayings that give some piece of wisdom. You'll find that in the Old Testament. Now, the New Testament, what are your options there? Well, obviously you have the gospel. These gospel narratives are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so that's specifically what I'm talking about, are these gospels according to these witnesses, each presenting a different emphasis about the person of Jesus Christ. And so knowing that you're in a gospel, knowing what the emphasis of that gospel is important in your interpretive process. Secondly, you have history. The book of history in the New Testament is going to be the book of Acts. It begins and sets forth a very clear direction, and Luke, being the inspired writer of the book, sets a clear direction in Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and verse 8 of what the book is going to entail. It's going to teach us the history of Christianity from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost part of the earth, and ends with Christianity there in Rome, the Apostle Paul being in prison. And then, so you have gospel, history. You have letters in the New Testament. These letters are broken up into various groups depending on who you read. Depends on what type of letter it is. Some are called the pastoral epistles. These are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And then you have others that are written specifically to believers in certain areas or particular churches. And then you also have apocalyptic. That's another way. If we were in the Old Testament writing this, we would say prophecy. But really, apocalyptic is not just the book of Revelation, although the book of Revelation is largely that. But you also have the book of First Thessalonians, Second Thessalonians. They both have prophetic truths given in them. Apocalyptic is the word, or apocalypsis. So a lot of the New Testament, the book of Matthew, chapter 24, 25, has some of that. In both the Old and New Testament, you're also going to find what we'll call sub-genres or subgenres. For example, you'll have parables. Those need to be interpreted a certain way. We'll look at that. Now, in this lesson, again, we're not going to look in detail on each one. I'm just giving you an overview of what you're looking for and getting you to start thinking this way for the interpretive process. You'll have riddles. Samson gave a riddle. You'll have sermons. Obviously, you have Jesus Christ and his sermons. Now, just take, for example, this picture here. This is volleyball. If you're playing volleyball, now here not too long ago, just maybe 10 years ago or so, the volleyball rules in high school volleyball were updated. But if you're playing volleyball, you have certain rules. You can't be in the net. You have to serve a certain way from a certain location. You have a certain number of people on the court. And there are ways that you get the points, and there are ways that you lose points. And you live by those rules on that court. You work by those rules. It would be a lot different than if you were playing soccer. You can't use, so in soccer you have particular rules, locations on the field, and if you took the volleyball rules onto the soccer field, well, first off, you'd get a lot of handballs and you would lose the soccer game because you can't even touch the soccer ball with your hand unless you're throwing it in, or you're the goalie. And so a third variation to this is baseball. Here, this young man has got a trophy in his hand. They apparently just won. Each of these three types of sports, and then we could add others in here, they're all played according to a set of rules within that field and within that event. And it's the same way with the genre. When we're in poetry, we need to know that that's what we're in. You play the game, you do the study according to that genre. You cannot mix those two up, or you will come out with a wrong understanding of the passage. So notice this by Brian Chappell here, this quote: "Study of a passage's context also requires the preachers to identify the genre or type of literature in which a biblical statement occurs. Many an error has been made by interpreting proverbs as promises, prophecy as history, parables as facts, and poetry as science." And so it's important in our interpretive process to consider the genre.